Joining us now is Dr. Chris Smith. He is the board chairperson with the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, to speak on a number of different issues, of course, as we are approaching 2 weeks since the tragic school shooting at Oxford High School on Tuesday, November 30th. Dr. Smith, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I appreciate having you on to talk about a complicated issue that has been plaguing our country for decades now at this point, and there doesn't seem to have been any progress on it for a number of different reasons, mostly political, in some ways very ideological issues, and it's more of a situation, it seems to me, from the outside looking in, as agreeing to disagree to the point of inaction. So when you heard about the shooting at Oxford High School, being that it was right here in our local area, it was here in the state of Michigan, what was your initial reaction to it, and what are your thoughts on the action that Michigan needs to be taking to prevent further acts of violence like this in our schools and beyond going forward?
Well, of course, I was shocked. This is something we all can relate to. We've all been students in school, and to picture our own experiences. Many of us have been parents and had kids gone through school where, as these events occur around the country, we have concerns about our own children. And now I'm a grandparent, anticipating my grandchildren moving through school. And so often the big events have been elsewhere. And I think that maybe takes away some of the immediacy of concern about feeling it and doing something about it. But now it's right here. You know, this is our fellow Michiganders. And it is a moment to try to discuss and consider things to do. The first reaction we often see is, how can we bunkerize schools? How can we turn them into security bunkers? And I think we do have to think about security in schools. We can't ignore that. But I don't think we can ignore the impact that may have on the educational experience of children, on the new roles and responsibilities we impose on teachers, and detrimental effects of that sort. And certainly, I think we have to, again, go back to one of the real root enabling causes of this, and that is the easy availability of firearms in our state and in the United States, and the lethality of the firearms that are available to civilians in terms of ammunition capacity, velocity, and that sort of thing. But I think you're right. The guns and gun ownership have become such an ideological issue and cultural symbol that it has really impeded our ability to identify the common ground that I think is available to us on specific facets of the issue of gun availability and the types of guns available.
We're joined by Dr. Chris Smith, board chairperson with the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, joining us on the MegaCast. So I'd like to ask for your opinion on the next steps that should be taken. But before that, I want to give you the opportunity to discuss a little bit about what the Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence's goals are in terms of the gun issue. As far as I know from reading into your organization is not focused on preventing people from obtaining guns, but in prevention rather of acts of violence or tragic accidents that may happen by a lack of responsible gun ownership. Is that correct?
I would say that is accurate, although may require a little further explanation. We respect the Second Amendment. I mean, I'm a professor of criminal justice at MSU for many decades. I teach about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to protect a right of gun ownership for law-abiding Americans, and we respect that, and it kind of works against everyone's purposes for those who claim that any regulation of guns is a secret attempt to take guns away from everyone. That can't happen because of the Second Amendment. Now, while we do respect the right to gun ownership, we do question the nature of guns that are available to the civilian population. You know, my son is a military officer, he's an infantry officer. We have these discussions about the lethality of the AR-15, for example, and other kinds of semi-automatic weapons that have very large ammunition capacity. You know, in the worst case scenario of permitting these things in civilian hands, or even by permitting, I don't necessarily mean every possession is lawful, but it's easy enough for people to obtain, was the Dayton, Ohio mass shooting in their restaurant bar area in August of 2019, where the shooter was able to shoot 26 people in 32 seconds. 26 people in 32 seconds. And I think that should raise serious questions for us about what is made available when the Supreme Court has said the fundamental purpose is self-defense in your home. And so other specific kinds of things that we would want people to talk about and consider: safe storage laws to keep firearms away from kids, and extreme risk protection order laws that other states have. So judges, based on evidence, could temporarily remove from people in emotional or mental health crises firearms from their home. 2/3 of the people who die from firearms, it's suicides. And we need to focus on that as well. So we're trying to point out there are facets to this issue we ought to be able to talk about to reduce risk and reduce harm, without people raising a hue and cry about someone's trying to take away all my guns. And we really would like to advocate a research, evidence-oriented view of gun policy. What does research say about what has been done in various states that reduce the rate of deaths and injuries? Don't act on ideology and belief, act based on available social science research.
So, Dr. Smith, in comparison to statute, in comparison to law in other states, what are some of those, in your opinion and in the opinion of your organization, some of those holes in the law here in the state of Michigan on the gun front that may be not necessarily encouraging events like what we saw at Oxford High School and other mass shootings, but may not be preventing them?
Yeah, I mean, in effect, you create an environment through, as you call it, holes in your laws. You create an environment that can enable greater risks, right? So there are states that have safe storage laws that impose responsibility on people to take measures to keep their firearms secure in their homes, and very explicitly raise the prospect of being prosecuted if you have an unsecure firearm in your home that comes into the possession of a child or teen and results in the injury or death to a child or teen. We don't have that specifically in Michigan. The Oakland County prosecutor is proceeding under more general criminal laws with respect to the parents in Oxford, but we don't have the specific law in other states, and that's why those kinds of prosecutions in Michigan are so rare. There's a dozen other states that have detailed laws about family members and police can go to a judge and present evidence that somebody is in crisis in order to temporarily remove guns from the home. And this may have the biggest impact with respect to potential suicides, but there have been cases in some states of parents calling police about young adults and saying, you know, our son is mentally ill, we think he's going to harm somebody, and the police say our state has no law that permits us to intervene until he does something. And there was a mass shooting, for example, at the University of California, Santa Barbara that followed an incident like that. And then we do see some states that have limits on the ammunition capacity of magazines, that limit it to 10 bullets, and then it forces the shooter to stop and reload more frequently, which creates opportunities for people to escape from situations or for heroic individuals to intervene and stop shooting. So, I mean, there are some specific things that exist in other states that we ought to discuss and consider here.
We're joined by Dr. Chris Smith, the board chairperson of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, joining us today on the MegaCast. And so in terms of Michigan's laws currently in place, or what can be discussed as preventative measures, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly in this case, because this 15-year-old child was able to have seemingly such free access to this firearm, about gun security by the owners of these firearms. What laws are currently in place that are creating that, establishing the responsibility to properly store and secure your gun, or what could be put in place in terms of legislation to make that be what is expected legally of gun owners to prevent unnecessary or accidental or nefarious access to a firearm by somebody that is not the proper owner or responsible enough to conduct handling such a weapon?
Well, there's a couple different kinds of laws we see in place elsewhere. And of course, this issue doesn't just arise with mass shootings, which are relatively at schools, which are relatively infrequent, but it's the cases we see throughout the year where a 5-year-old finds a gun under the pillow or in the drawer and shoots his 3-year-old sister. We see those things with just heart-wrenching regularity. But, actual laws that say you can be criminally prosecuted and convicted if you're the owner of the firearm and it comes into the hands of a child or teen because you left it unsecure. And the other, issue with that is that firearms are, a very common target in burglaries. And if you leave your firearm in a way that's not secure and easy to steal, there are states that have laws that require you to report firearms are stolen. So at least the police are notified that has occurred and can be on the lookout and can look for patterns and have heightened awareness of burglaries in the area and what they are going after. And I know there are prosecutors, in Oakland County and some of the commentators as well that are a little frustrated that when something like this happens, it isn't clear that they will be successful in prosecuting the parents, even though the evidence the parents are currently presumptively innocent under our system, but the parents may be shown to have been very irresponsible in the way they stored their weapon. It remains to be seen what the evidence shows about that, and how do we create incentives on people? How do we deter conduct that increases risk to children in ways that really cause harm to society? And we would like to see the legislators, there are proposals in the legislature, and we would like to see them permitted to get hearings so the evidence could be heard from experts and there could be discussion by legislators from both parties of these issues. Right now in Michigan, I would say because of ideology, you don't even really get the proposed bills permitted to have hearings in the legislature in order for these discussions to be aired.
And so, Dr. Smith, being that you were a longtime professor of criminal justice at MSU, you've taught a lot about the Second Amendment, as you have mentioned earlier. Let's discuss that issue, because that seems to be that sticking point from one side of the aisle in particular. Is we're defending the Second Amendment, putting further laws in place that are more stringent on the gun front or make it tougher for people to obtain guns. Their ideology is that it is a direct violation of Second Amendment rights. For those that don't have a direct understanding of the Second Amendment. What was the intention of the Second Amendment? And of course, as all laws and all legal documents over time, their interpretation changes with the context of society. What is the current context by which the Second Amendment is defined here in the United States?
Well, I would just remind people that the words of the Second Amendment begin a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. And so there is a debate in the Supreme Court and among legal scholars about whether this amendment was solely about states being able to arm their militias without the federal government disarming states, or whether it was about individuals being able to own firearms. And in 2008, in a 5-4 vote, as close as you can have it on the Supreme Court, for the first time ever, right? I mean, the amendment was written in 1791, but it wasn't until 2008 that there was a majority on the Supreme Court to say, oh, wait, that stuff about the militia, that's just sort of an introduction. This is really about individuals being able to own firearms. So that's still subject to debate. But the key thing here is the current Supreme Court definition of the right under the Second Amendment is a right for law-abiding adults to keep handguns in their homes for self-defense. That's the limited definition of the Second Amendment. They're currently going to decide a case about whether states have an obligation to be freer in the way they permit people to get concealed carry permits or permits to carry in public. So there may be an expansion on the horizon about carrying. But the Supreme Court has never said weapons of war, large ammunition magazines, banning those violate the Second Amendment, or requiring people to lock things at home violate the Second Amendment. They have not said those things at all. And that's why those are all in play as policies for us to consider. And the state of our laws is not because of the U.S. Supreme Court. It's because of decisions and non-decisions by our legislature, which, as you say, are partly fed by people's beliefs about the Second Amendment, because much of the discussion about the Second Amendment is really people saying, here's what I want it to mean. It's not really about the legal definition of the Second Amendment.
Dr. Smith, just another couple minutes with you before we'll say goodbye. We're a little bit over time. Anything else at this moment that you would encourage Michiganders, both in leadership positions at the state level and common citizens like you and I, to be considering at this moment in time on this issue, so that we can have productive conversations and make the necessary changes that we need to prevent further acts of violence like we saw 2 weeks ago as of tomorrow at Oxford High School?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple things. One is, we become so numb to these episodes that they just pass and fade, and maybe we block them from our minds from the trauma. But I think we need to now, especially in Michigan, be aware, hey, this can happen anywhere. This can happen anywhere. And people need to contact their legislators and tell their legislators, here's my view. Here's my concern, here's my fear, and ask their legislators and ask political candidates, where do you stand? What are you going to do? And then come November, make it a higher priority when you're looking at candidates to say, do they share my view and concerns about gun issues? Because one of the things in the United States is we get a lot of reaction to a shooting, but come next election, there's not much evidence that the voters are still prioritizing that issue when the events that mobilized them had happened in the past. Then the other thing I think is we need to encourage the legislature to actually hold hearings on proposed bills, so that there is the opportunity to discuss and get news media coverage that really looks at both sides that are being presented in the legislature. Right now, past few years, we haven't had that at all. Bills are proposed and they just die as pieces of paper handed in and never get a hearing. The public on both sides of the issue deserves to have these discussions aired. And I think people should also be looking in their local communities, because there are cities that are, in the state as well, thinking of ways to invest in local communities to try to reduce conflict in local communities, educate people about these problems, and there may be benefit in these kinds of grassroots programs that reach out to people and try to solve problems in neighborhoods and in communities without young people picking up firearms and thinking they need to solve their disputes themselves.
Well, Dr. Smith, we appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today and discussing a complicated issue so we can get some context, get some information from a criminal justice and Second Amendment expert, and try to think about the steps forward we can take on a community level and then at the state level as well to address this issue. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me, and I do appreciate your very thoughtful approach to asking questions about this.